Hello everyone, my name is Danielle. I'm a writer, a reader, I'm a student, and today we are talking about the reader part. I love doing these types of videos because I just get to talk about books that I'm interested in all of the time. A fun fact you may not know about me is that I love horror books. There's a lot of opportunity when it comes to horror, especially when it comes to internal conflict and analyzing the self in relation to monstrosity. I love horror. And it's spooky month, so why not do a video giving you recommendations on to get in the spooky mood. I'm going to be giving you some of the best spooky books I have read, and hopefully you guys enjoy them as well. Let me know if you guys end up picking a book up. I really am looking forward to seeing what you guys think about the books that I'm going to recommend. So, the first one is obvious, my favorite book of all time, Tender is the Flesh by Agustina Bastarrica. So good. Oh my god. The author is actually Argentinian. It was translated from Spanish, so it's a translated word. All of the animals in our world have gotten sick and we can't eat them anymore, so instead they rely on eating human meat for their protein. There's no better premise than critiquing capitalism and the horrors of it, rather than literally eating other human beings and dehumanizing them to the point where you see them as literal meat. The descriptions are haunting and disgusting in all of the best ways possible. I love that book. I love this book. I highly recommend it to everyone. I love this book. Have I convinced you yet? I hope I have. It's my favorite book of all time. And I'm very picky about my books. The next book I'm going to recommend is called The Deep by Nick Cutter. If you are scared of the ocean, I highly recommend this book. It is so... Ooh, Nick Cutter is just so good at writing cosmic horror, which the ocean, I don't think that we fear the ocean enough as a society. I think that we should fear the ocean more. We know more about space than our own ocean, which makes up about 70% of the planet, by the way. So the premise of this book is that there's this plague going on that makes people forget all of their memories and pretty much turns them into walking zombies, right? But they found a cure, not only the cure to that plague, but also the cure to pretty much anything. It's actually at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, and they call it ambrosia. So the main character, it's this guy that has to go to the bottom of the Mariana Trench to go find his brother, who is like a super scientist, super smart, but for some reason his brother working at the bottom of the Mariana Trench hasn't been responding to the messages going on down there. I love this book. I didn't realize just how claustrophobic it was. I didn't realize, I was like taking breaks from the book, and I didn't realize, and I thought it might have been like, oh, I wasn't really enjoying the book, maybe, but no, I think it's because it was so claustrophobic. Nick Cutter is so good at writing claustrophobia at the bottom of the Mariana Trench that I had to take a break from the book, and I think that speaks to Nick Cutter's skill as a writer in writing atmosphere and tension. There are so many images that I have from this book that are just stuck in my mind, like the moment when they're going down in the submarine and the main character is looking out at the glass and he's just waiting for he feels the deep pressure and the weight of the ocean way down, and he's waiting for there to be a hairline crack in the glass, and it's like playing tricks on his eyes. If there was a crack, they would die just like that. He knows that, but he's like imagining hairline cracks. Oh my god, it's like so good. It's the most terrifying thing in the best way possible. So the next book I'm going to recommend is Suffer the Children by Craig DeLuey. This is just a classic horror book. A couple like intrigue weave throughout the book to make it that much more personable. So the premise of this book is that all children, I think like 12-ish and younger, they all just die. They all drop dead, which is terrifying in and of itself. But given like 3 days later, they all come back to life. But they can only stay around if they have blood, and they need a lot of it. So they pretty much turn into like vampires. I love this book because it very much focused on the microscopic the microscopic punishments of what would happen of this. Like, we follow two families, one of which is, you know, a very nuclear conservative family, and the other is a single mom with her son. So we're not looking at it from the perspective of like the president of the US who is trying to respond to this epidemic. Instead, we're focused on two families that are just trying their best and trying to care for their kids, and it's freaking heartbreaking. It really goes to show how much are you willing to do for your kids, and unsurprisingly, a lot of people are willing to do some abhorrent things for their kids. I liked how it focused on the punishments of the individuality of American society. I very much recommend that book, especially if you like creepy kid horror. Speaking of creepy kid horror, I have another recommendation for you. The next one is called The Perfect Child by Lucinda Berry. If you're a big fan of like the creepy child trope in horror, this is the one. So it was actually, I believe Lucinda Berry is actually a social worker writing on the horrors of social work in America. Couldn't be better written. So you have this young couple, Christopher and Hannah, that desperately want a child of their own, but they haven't been having any luck. So instead they choose to adopt Janie, who is an abandoned 6-year-old girl who has experienced extensive trauma. And as they are trying to care for this traumatized child, they soon realize that they are way in over their head. The way that Janie kind of reacts, I guess, is that she lashes out. She loves Christopher. She loves her dad so much, but she pours all of her rage and anger at Hannah, and Hannah is drowning under the responsibilities of new motherhood. Christopher refuses to see her true nature, and all of this threatens to pull apart the family structure. I mean, like, I enjoyed this book. It was a fun read, and throughout the whole time, you're waiting for the ball to drop. Like, you feel this tension rising and rising, and it doesn't happen until the last 25% of the book when everything comes crashing down. And all of that build-up finally has a satisfying, like, oh shit. It was a classic creepy kid horror book. I think the most terrifying part was learning about the horrors of the foster care system, honestly. Next book I'm gonna recommend is The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. This book follows about 4 Indian Americans who have killed an elk nearly like years ago against and breaking their society's rules, and that elk has come back for revenge. I think this book would really hit home if you're Indian or First Nation. It shows the horrors of what happens when you neglect your society's social order, because the elk comes back in terrifying way. By the way, if you're not afraid of elk, what aren't you afraid of? Because look at the elk. They're terrifying. I mean, I related to it even though I'm not Native American. Like, what happens when you lose your cultures and traditions, and the repercussions of that could be murderous. If you like, even like Appalachian horror or folk horror, especially like American-based woodsy aesthetic horror, I think you would really enjoy this book. For fans of Get Out and Us, we have Lakewood by Megan Giddings. The main character, her name is Lena Johnson, and her grandmother has passed away, and now she is in charge of caring for her sick mother. She is a college student and she is struggling financially, obviously, and she finally finds this sort of, what's a word for it, focus group, pyramid group, where it's super high paying, no questions asked, it's out of pocket, they have health insurance and everything, it's fantastic. It's all done at an experiment in Lakewood, the questions of which she doesn't really know, nor is she allowed to know. They give her eye drops, they give her golden pills, they ask her questions that she doesn't understand, but it doesn't matter. It's like a health experiment. So she knows that the scientific discoveries that are happening at Lakewood could be revolutionary, but could be deadly to the individual. So as the truths of the program start to unfold, Lena starts to realize that she is way in over her head, and she needs to leave lest she sacrifice everything for her family. This book was very much inspired by Henrietta Lacks, if you don't know that situation. So the story of Henrietta Lacks is that pretty much these scientists took her cells without her knowledge and used it to make revolutionary achievements in science. They created like a cell line that could reproduce indefinitely cells that was instrumental within cancer research. Of course, she was a Black woman and they didn't ask for her permission, and that is where the troubles lie in. So this is very much based off of real world events. This reminded me of when the government gave a bunch of Black men syphilis. The ending was fantastic. I think that it was the correct ending. It's like she made the right stylistic choice as well. I really appreciate like the sort of, I don't know how else to describe the atmosphere as aside from like a pig's tail, where it swirls and swirls and swirls until you don't know where you're going anymore. You just get sucked into this horrifying Lakewood world, this like sterile environment. It's so unsettling and uncanny. Horror has been a great way to talk about the horrors of racism and sexism. So if you are a fan of Get Out and Us and more psychological horror, I very much would recommend Lakewood by Megan Giddings. This one actually might be one of my favorite horror books. It's called Last Days by Brian Evenson. Ooh, this book is so good. I love this book. I feel like I'm saying that about every book, but I love this book. This book is, so the main character is a detective and he is investigating this cult, but in order to do so, he must literally give up his body because the cult believes that the more you give, the more you amputate parts of your body off, the more closer to God you are. And the main character, his name is Klein, and he has to find out who killed the cult leader, but he must literally lose parts of himself in order to give into the madness inside. Klein is such an interesting character. Like, he's not likable. I mean, like, he is likable to the extent where you root for the main character, but he's not like a good person. And I think that works fantastically where it comes to terms with this cult. And usually I don't like cult books. They're not my favorite. I find that demonizing people in cults to be kind of weird, but this one is just so over the top. This whole story, you can see how much he's losing himself, not just literally but figuratively, and then at the end of the book, it's like he becomes the monster too. It's so good. It's so scary. And usually I'm not a fan of gore, not because I find it disgusting, rather I find it very cheap and ridiculous use of horror. It's not my favorite. I think that it's cheap. It doesn't scare me, but this one fucking got me. It reminded me of, it terrified me to be reminded that at the end of the day, we are just sacks of meat. Our consciousness is nothing compared to the grand scheme of the universe. We are just meat. I don't know if you would call this a horror book, nor do I know what genre you would put this in. I would say horror. So the book is called Tampa by Alyssa Nutting. It is about this woman who is a new teacher, and her main goal, or her only goal in life, is to groom and molest the middle school boys. That is her only dream in life. So obviously, huge trigger warning for this book. However, I found this book to be incredibly entertaining. It kind of pokes fun at itself, funnily enough. The sex scenes are written in such like over the top pornographic detail that you kind of have to like scoff at the ridiculousness of the scene. And I think that was the right stylistic choice in writing about such a dark topic. This book was actually based off of a real world case. The Tampa teacher Deborah Lefebvre, who got no jail time because her lawyer argued that she was apparently too pretty for prison. Very much recommend this book if you like psychological horror and you just want to see, especially if you like books that were, because I read this book wondering like, oh, is it enough? Like, is it like, can I handle this as sort of a challenge to myself? So if you're one of those people, recommend this book as well. The 9th book I will be recommending to you is Flowers in the Attic by V.E. Schwab. Now, is this book good? Depending on who you ask. If you ask me, I would say no. But the reason I recommend her is because she is such a well-known author. Her books were kind of marketed as like the books you shouldn't read to young girls in the 70s, 80s, I believe. So the premise of this book is that this mother and 4 of her kids end up having to go back down to the rural South to try and reclaim some of their generational wealth. And they're waiting for their grandfather to die so that they could inherit that wealth. But the grandfather doesn't know that she's had children, and the grandfather would not approve if she had children. So instead, the mom and the mom's mom decide to hide the kids in the attic and waiting for the dad to die. This book is good. If you're a 12-year-old girl, if you have any young teenage girls in your life, I think that they would actually like this book. I read it when I was 17, I believe, and I was just over the age of old enough to where I couldn't appreciate not bad literature, but just literature written for the fun of it, like Twilight and stuff like that. Like Southern horror and Victorian horror. Also, the house seems to be a character on its own. There's incest as well, and the horrors of growing up isolated, and there's also talking about the horrors of parentification in young children through their younger siblings. Last book I'm going to recommend, it's a gothic horror book. How could I, of all people, not mention a gothic horror book? And that is Mexican Gothic. If you love gothic horror and you want a change of pace aside from the sterile old normal English setting, Mexican Gothic is for you. Mexican Gothic is set in Mexico during the 1950s. This book is so good. It's like a work of post-colonial Gothic literature. So the main character, Naomi, she has to go back to this old Gothic town to rescue one of her cousins who wrote a letter asking for help. Naomi seems like someone who shouldn't be the one rescuing people. She is completely materialistic. She loves dresses and makeup, and she's very into her own head. You know, she wants to rescue her cousin, who is the complete opposite of her, super shy and gentle and not much of a people person. But her cousin has written a note asking her family for help. Naomi goes to rescue her, but then she also finds out that she is trapped there as well. I read this book for a class. It was like Women's Writers or something like that. And this book was so good. I love this book. I love gothic horror. If you love gothic horror and everything that comes with it, especially all of the dark things that come with it, like the fact that the house is a character in and of itself. I love the atmosphere of a gothic setting. I love the architecture. I love the dressing. I love the commentary on sex and class, and also the incest that was involved in England at the time. And you also get a nice change of pace since it's set in Mexico during the 50s. Oh my god, it's so good. It's so good. And the cover is also just gorgeous. Those are the books that I highly recommend that I have read before. Now, I want to talk to you about the books that I want to read for the spooky season. First one that I'm reading is called Acolyte by Nick Cutter. As you can see, a familiar thing. I've read a lot of Nick Cutter's books. I love his work. So Acolyte by Nick Cutter is his foray into religious dystopian horror. And as of right now, I think it's really good. The main character is an unlikable piece of shit, but still I'm somehow rooting for him. So the premise of that book is that it reminds me a lot of the world of BioShock. With the way that everything is kind of 50s and super eccentric, but deep below the surface there is an undertone of racism and classism in it. Like my bookmark, it's a receipt. The next one is called A Certain Hunger by Chelsea G. Summers. Let me talk about how beautiful this cover is. So I believe this is another cannibal book. I've heard it related to Tender is the Flesh, where people are like, if you like Tender is the Flesh, you will love A Certain Hunger. And I think this is more so going to focus on the sexism part of capitalism and what it means to consume another person's labor and using their body as the conduit of the metaphor. I believe this book is based off of Dorothy Daniels, who is a food critic, but soon enough she discovers that food isn't enough for her. She wants something else, and I think she might end up eating men. I've also heard this book as described as like, I support women's rights and women's wrongs, so I'm anything but a stickler. Next book I'm reading is called 19 Claws and the Blackbird by Agustina Bazterrica. As you can see, that is the same author as the one who wrote Tender is the Flesh. This was recently translated. I read a couple of her short stories in here on its own, but they were originally written in Spanish. So this is the English translation. I speak Spanish, not very well, but I can read it better. And this book is so good. The first short story, mwah. The imagery is disgusting. It made me gag, but it was everything that I loved from Tender is the Flesh. It's so good. I love these books. I love the author. Okay, so those are all of the books that I'm looking forward to reading this spooky season, and all the books I recommend for reading this spooky season. I hope y'all enjoyed. Let me know what books you guys are reading for spooky season. I would very much love to know. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. And I appreciate you hanging around, and thank you so much for watching. I'm trying to upload videos every Monday at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and I would greatly appreciate it if you subscribed. So yeah, thank you again, and I will see you again next week. Okay, bye.